Hi, Mike.
How are you, Naveen?
I'm very well, mate. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good.
Excellent. So, where are you joining us today? Are you based out in the US or are you in the UK at the moment?
I'm actually in the UK. I came over last year, about a year ago, and part of my story is I can't go back. So here I
Um, Well, we'll get into that in a sec. Listen, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and our Cybertalks community. Really excited to have you on and for you to share some of your experiences. But before we get into some of the juicy stuff, it'd be really good if you could just sort of give our audience a bit of a background and flavor to sort of where you're from and what you've done in your career and sort of that kind of stuff, and we can go from there.
Sure. So I'm from the States, obviously. I was born in Washington, D.C. My dad at the time was stationed at the NSA and worked there when I was a little kid. He left shortly after I was born, and I grew up with my mom and my brother while he was serving the government. I got exposed to a lot of really cool stuff as a kid. That took me through high school. I wasn't very challenged in school. Barely graduated, surprisingly enough. And once I got out, I realized that I had a talent for computers. And I kind of knew that all along. I had been building electronic sets and stuff like that since I was a little kid. That was kind of their way of parent time, babysitting. So I became a pen tester. I did some time in the military. I worked with Anonymous for a long time, and that led me into what I'm doing now, working with the Met Police, working to help kids make better cyber choices so they don't have to experience what I experienced through my career path.
So that's really interesting, and can we just sort of touch on what you said about helping educate kids not make certain choices? What do you mean by that? I mean,
sure. So the program that I help with is kind of like a intervention. They call it the intervention workshop. So they bring in kids who have been identified as being potential cyber criminals. They've committed some sort of low-level cyber crime or have come up on the Met Police radar as being a potential cyber criminal. So they get these kids. The kids volunteer for the program. They bring them out on the weekend, and I spend time with them as well as their parents and talk to them about what I went through my life up until now, what it took to make the right choice, and the resources that are available to these kids now to help them stay away from making the wrong choice. There's so many more resources now than there was let's say when I was a kid.
Do you think that because of the way technology is progressing so rapidly, and how connected young people are, they're actually presented with opportunistic pathways into something that may be regarded as criminal or an intention to be criminal unwittingly, and get lured into that space quite quickly? Do you see that a lot in that?
Yeah, absolutely. See it especially with online gaming. Kids being recruited through online gaming systems, platforms. Starts out simple, maybe making a modded character or, finding a glitch or a cheat. And then they start getting groomed to commit larger crimes. But a lot of that takes place, especially on platforms like Fortnite. For a while, that was a very hot spot as far as recruiting kids and approaching kids in the United States. And pretty much we saw that echo throughout the world.
And do you find now with the program work that you're doing that there is a sort of genuine level of interest and participation in looking at the other aspects of cybersecurity and not necessarily the criminal? And then also, if I may, what does that do from a psychological perspective to a young person who may potentially have been groomed to do something that's illicit, to then suddenly reflecting on what they're doing, and what kind of impact do you think that has on them? Maybe what kind of impact did it have on you as a child as well?
Sure. So I think the impact is pretty traumatic. One piece of the puzzle that I haven't mentioned yet is the fact that some of these kids deal and cope with being neurodiverse or having some sort of level of autism or Asperger's. And a lot of these kids don't know that what they've done was wrong until someone actually approaches them from the law enforcement, sits them down, and explains it to them. Another big gap that I see throughout the world, especially in the UK, is explaining to those kids what the CMA is and how that should guide their online presence. Right now, there's kind of a question as to who needs to do that for these kids. Law enforcement can't do it by themselves. It takes a village, in my eyes, to raise a child. So it's got to be a holistic view, right? So you have to have law enforcement, schools, parents. Everybody has to participate, because those children are going to use electronic assets in all of those locations. So it's important to be able to convey the CMA properly, so that they do know if they're actually committing a crime or if they're going down that pathway.
And I suppose you touched on a really good point about electronic assets. I mean, kids are effectively born with devices in their hands now. Not like in our day where, 15, 20 years ago, we didn't have access to all this stuff. So it's a normality, I suppose, for children. So sort of building upon that, and sort of you touched on your experiences as a young person. So did you have a sort of similar experience in being pulled into something that was quite dark and illicit, or was it by choice? I mean,
it was absolutely by choice. I learned from very early on that I had a capability or a talent to do certain things with computers that they probably shouldn't be doing. And so I focused on that, but I was more of a isolationist, I guess. I spent a lot of my time working and trying to figure things out on my own instead of getting with a group. Now, when I went into the military, I did intelligence and I did cryptography. And part of what put me into the hacktivist realms was I didn't really agree with some of the things I was seeing coming back from the war on media and what was actually happening there. That it caused a lot of anger and hostility because of the way that we were being treated. And so that kind of fed into the motivations and the drive behind Anonymous.
Right. And I suppose sort of the weaponization of that information is also quite dangerous, and level of misrepresentation in dissemination of it. So did you feel that being part of that group then gave you a sort of subjective voice to be able to express what you needed to express with some level of cover?
Yeah, absolutely. I knew that eventually, we'd already seen the telltale signs, but I knew eventually it would come to an end. I was hoping that it wouldn't come to an end where it equated to me behind bars. And luckily it didn't. But yeah, I mean, getting into Anonymous, the ideology that we had back then when the group started is much different than what it is now. And I think we're starting to see a lot of the old ideology resurfacing during this time of pandemic and the issues with China and the US.
I mean, that's really interesting you say, because I read a recent article on the BBC about the sort of resurgence of Anonymous and wanting to play a part with social and geopolitical discourse in some way. And I've always regarded Anonymous, and correct me if I'm wrong, which was more of a access to information that you're not going to be able to see because it's regarded as sensitive or critical, national security, but always has a negative connotation. And not all aspects of Anonymous are the same, and can be confusing for people that don't understand how that ideology sits together. So when you sort of mentioned the difference between when you started and what's going on, what do you think is different? And maybe explain it to our viewers so they can get a sort of better understanding of it. So. Sure.
So I'll take us back to the Ferguson riots in Missouri. That was one of the first times I had seen people with Guy Fawkes masks setting fires to buildings. And that definitely was not the ideology that we started out with. And that's one of the things that kind of turned me away from what was going on, because I didn't leave one bad situation to walk into another bad situation with kinetic consequences. So what they're doing now with the issues in the U.S. and the protests, they do serve a purpose. There is a purpose behind Anonymous, and the word needs to get out there, and they need to have a voice. That's one of the constitutional rights in the U.S. is to have that voice and to use it. Unfortunately, in some of these protests, people hijack the platform or hijack the message and turn it into something that it's not. And that's one thing that we had seen with newer members of Anonymous or people who were claiming Anonymous. They were hijacking messages and taking on operations that didn't fit our ideology. And for their sake, I really hope that ideology, that message becomes more pure, like it used to be. Because the world does need a voice, and the people do need a voice. One person is really easy to ignore, but millions, it's kind of hard.
And do you think, and this is something that strikes me as quite interesting about the whole concept, is there isn't a given leadership role. There isn't a single point of focus. So it is quite easy then for someone to come and hijack a narrative. So how does the group then stay on track with making sure that they are then, because even denouncing that change in narrative is also very difficult. So it's sort of spirally confusing for a lot of people as to where the message lies, right?
Yeah, exactly. And as far as changing the ideology midstream and vocalizing that or carrying on the true operations, this is where you get into like the splinter groups that broke away from Anonymous, and there's several that maybe didn't carry the same ideology or maybe didn't agree with a certain operation, and people tend to splinter and become other groups. It's no different than traditional terrorism.
And what do you think about what's going on? Sort of, I touched on this in my opening about it just feels like a very strange time for the world, with a pandemic that governments didn't do much about, when they had the information, and truly they probably had that information for a lot longer than has been disclosed. The racial question resurgence again, which has been going on for decades, as long as I'm concerned. Very tyrannical actions from Western governments. Where do you see a role for a group like Anonymous, where if information is actually being suppressed, which is of value, where governments may be fudging the truth or misrepresenting data?
They will.
Sorry, go on.
They will. They'll definitely expose the information. That's one thing that Anonymous is very good at. Using the hive mentality to gather information and disseminating it. Now, what happens with that information, I don't know at this point. The U.S. has kind of fallen into what I call a perfect storm, right? So we had the pandemic outbreak. 40 million people lost jobs. People have to go to food banks to feed themselves in the U.S. Things that we had never experienced in the U.S. during my lifetime. And then you couple that with what occurred, unfortunately, in Minneapolis. And I mean, it's just a perfect storm. It's really got the internal fabric of the U.S. Very wrinkled and torn. But I think that in order to get that justice, long-term justice, you're going to need somebody like Anonymous or some other group, Black Lives Matters, to really drive home that point and get it across. Will it change things forever? Probably not, because you're going to have bad characters in every group. You can't avoid that. But I really hope that they come to some sort of agreement.
I mean, and I don't know if this is the right group, but Real Evil had posted a couple of weeks ago that they'd ascertained X amounts of information on Donald Trump unless he paid a ransom, right? A random figure of 10 million quid or $10 million or something. And the deadline passed and they never released anything. And then they made another announcement that they had some other information. And again, they never released anything. So nothing incriminating about him has come out. But it just also strikes me as a sort of odd timing for them to start trying to cause disruption than not have the evidence to back up what they're saying. And I suppose that then discredits, anyone that has a legitimate concern around freedom of speech and being able to shine a light on potentially corrupt individuals that are in power, which is another real concern. How do you feel then with all of these other activist groups that sit out there that are intentionally trying to disrupt things without any basis, but also doing it purely for monetary gain?
Yeah, that's something that we'll never be able to get away from. Anytime that you're going to have a collection of people online, you're going to have some sort of cybercrime going. But as far as the timing for Anonymous and their message to China and to the U.S., one thing you also have to take consideration too, and a lot of people don't, is that groups like Anonymous have been infiltrated by law enforcement and by intelligence agencies all over the world multiple times over. So it's not uncommon for a claim to be made or something, some other information to come out that would damage maybe the credibility of Anonymous or the legitimacy of their message. And they do have plants within the group that's their sole purpose, is misinformation.
And do you think there will be a time, and I'm not sure if this has happened yet, a time where groups like Anonymous are effectively regarded as terrorists? They're a terrorist organization, and other hacking groups would be classified as a terrorist organization, therefore giving the arm of the law a lot more leeway in persecuting individuals that participate in such activity.
Well, I can tell you in the U.S., the arm of the law has no specified length when it comes to hackers. They had the Patriot Act that came out in 2011 or 2001 that basically gave people the ability to snitch on their neighbors and that type of activity. It gets out of hand, because anytime you have something like this, like a pandemic or even like the riots, there's a lot of emotion that gets wrapped up in these events. A lot of loss, a lot of depression, a lot of financial loss. And hacking groups, terrorists, politicians even take advantage of that emotion-filled kind of chaos, and they use it to their advantage. Government does the same thing. Now, as far as policing goes, in the U.S., it's not just a police and a racial problem with African-American men. A lot of people are afraid to deal with the police. Before I came over, I literally got ripped out of the driver's side window of my car for having a radio too loud. My radio wasn't even on. So those are the type of things that we deal with. The powers that they have for law enforcement in the U.S. is a lot different. And when they prosecute hackers or hacktivists, they like to make a example out of us. And they do carry, a lot of the guys that I know that have gotten multiple years in prison have been treated like terrorists. And in 2016, after my story went public, the International Business Times picked up the story, and in the paper, the headline was U.S. military man turns cyber terrorist. So I mean, that was 2016.
Yeah,
that's followed me, for 4 years, and I still have issues with certain agencies. Because of some of the headlines and some of the things that were explained, but only from one point of view.
So, I mean, that in itself must put a personal toll on your own mental health, right? Dealing with all of that stuff, if you're having to, address issues from government agencies on a continuous basis, I mean, it must not make you feel safe in some regards, right?
Yeah, well, when I had to go to the hospital last year and came back to the hotel, and my passport had been stolen from the hotel room. And then the U.S. not issuing another passport or allowing re-entry. Things like that, I don't feel protected. I don't feel like I have the same rights as most people in the U.S. But that's what we face as hackers or security researchers, that if you gain too much knowledge or you're too close to a specific source of information, they can make your life pretty miserable. And they do it quite often.
What's interesting is that the fact that the US government won't embrace the skill set that you have to use for good. Rather, doesn't that then people within the same position of you will get lucrative offers from rogue governments to go and do illicit things for them? I don't see how that helps the United States in any way, shape, or form, right? Because you're just saying China, Russia, North Korea, come, we'll pay you.
Right. And that happens. It happens quite a bit. And not only that, but as a confidential informant, I was in the groups already, but they gave me authorization to continue working with those foreign groups. So, I mean, I can't explain everything the US government does, but the abuse of power is pretty rampant across the gamut.
So I don't know if you recall an offspring of a Hamas-related cyber terrorist group infiltrated Israeli security services, I think tail end of 2018 or beginning some point in 2019. But that retaliation was swift. That was a armed retaliation. And it was the first one I'd ever seen that in an event of a cyber attack, they launched a military attack on the base of where that cyber attack was coming from. Do you think that we in the West are also heading down that path where it no longer is just a case of electronic assets being at risk? We're going to shut people down.
Absolutely. I mean, during Obama's tenure in the White House, he basically made the policy in the statement that any cyber attack on the national grid, the critical infrastructure, would be an act of war. So in that case, it would go kinetic. But yeah, the attack that Israel had after the cyber attack that Hamas carried out, that was the first time that I had seen it go kinetic, go from something cyber to kinetic, and it was very effective. If I remember correctly, they took out the whole floor of that building where those hackers were supposedly located.
Yeah. I suppose it's really interesting what you said. Under Obama they did that. However, pure evidence that that the 2016 elections were tampered with, through electronic manipulation, but the Trump government did nothing. Right?
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot to that story as well. The group that they put the tampering on was not 100% responsible for what happened. And there was a lot of intelligence operations going on during the election. And there's a lot of moving parts, and there still is. You still have Antifa causing political issues, pushing things on the far left. It's political chaos in the U.S. right now, to be honest with you.
So we've got another massive general election coming up in the United States. So what from your perspective in terms of what you would think or predict would be the next sort of major sort of technical breach, compromise, to the run up of this election. Where did they go from there? Who's the backer? He's managed to upset China. Not that close with Russia. Who's left to help support? But even on the other end, do you think there'll be a bag of dirty tricks being played across the board? And to the fundamental question of how can you trust the result of a general election?
I don't trust the result of any election in the US. To be honest with you, if you look at the way the U.S. voting system is put together, you may have a Republican state, and the civilians may vote Republican, but the Electoral College doesn't necessarily have to vote that way. But yeah, I think that what's going to happen is we're not going to see like a major hack to do damage or let's say personal information like doxing. I think we're going to see more information uncovered about the pandemic and about intentions of the U.S. government. I know that a couple of hacktivist groups, I'm sure, are already planning their attacks on different agencies to get information regarding what the government's up to. Because, like I said, there's a lot of turmoil in the U.S. and a lot of people see these this whole issue with the racism and stuff like that as it's kind of like a smokescreen. Because it's always during chaos and during unstableness that the U.S. implements some sort of archaic control measure. During 9/11, it was the Patriot Act. You know, hey, we'll protect you. You know, we know you're scared and these evil terrorists, but if you give us your freedom, we'll protect you forever. And they're going to see the same thing.
Yeah, and swipes at, you know, large, you know, big tech, which have taken place obviously in the last couple of days as well, and that you can probably predict if there's lack of development in a cure for coronavirus, it will be the pharma guys will be next, right? You know, so very interesting. So sort of circling back to the stuff that you're doing now, and all of that's really interesting. So thank you so much. You know, so you work very, very closely with law enforcement itself. So how does that genuinely feel, having sort of done that full circle back, you know, back to where, you know, having served and then coming back again, but doing it with you know, Metropolitan Police? Does that feel odd in any way, or?
The first time I gave a talk was at Westminster University. The first talk I gave with a policeman, someone from law enforcement, and I was really nervous that night because I'd never sat on stage with the policeman. And up until that point, my interaction had not been too positive with law enforcement. But I made really good friends with Andy Chapman, and we've been friends ever since, and spoke on several different panels together. And I find that the law enforcement here in the UK is very inviting, and they don't try to intimidate. It's not a battle of intimidation with them, and they generally want to see people do well, as opposed to the US, where, you know, hey, if they can parade you in front of NBC and lock you up for breaking into TJ Maxx or Target, you know, the agent, that's a career lift for him. So
yeah, I think the attitudes and approach are slightly different, you know, and there's a massive cultural difference in the way that I suppose the UK operate to the US, which is really interesting. I think there's so much more that we can talk about, and I'm going to suggest that we look to schedule a part 2 so that we can help you know, share some of the experience that you've got, because I think there's a great deal we can talk about. Fortunately, we were running out of time, so I'm going to switch to questions. We had a couple of questions pop on the screen, but they were too quick to read. So one of them is around, so a gentleman's been asking, here we go, Tom Johnson. Try to be a role model for your people. I've got myself into a lot of trouble when I was younger, thrown out of college, groomed for pirate games, etc. But I've found a lot of these young people have not developed the moral, ethical framework they need to understand their actions. Do you feel by sharing that your life experience, you can help them develop it, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. The kids that I've dealt with so far at the intervention workshops have all been great and super intelligent. It's not so much that they lack the moral compass that we have. You know, like you said, it's still in development, but I think the bigger issue is not understanding 100% what the law entails and what it allows them to do as users on the internet.
So that popped up and dropped off really quickly. I talked to the ICDDF and was terrified the police have been instrumental in how develop professionally, and I'm very thankful to them. And I think that's probably a good way to go, Tom. Perfect. Look, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any sort of quick roundup summary you'd like to give on anything you're working on at the moment, people or you know, parents that can direct their kids if they're watching to anything that you're doing, or any links that you want to share. But I do think there's a lot more you can share, and then we'll definitely schedule a part 2. But sort of just to do a summary of anything useful that you can share with them now.
Sure thing. There's a lot of resources for kids out there to help them get into security, whether it be Cyber UK Challenge, or whether it be Hack the Box or Vuln Hub. There's tons of resources, and if anybody needs some guidance on that, you can always reach me on Twitter, and I'll do my best.
Perfect. Well, MJ, thank you so much for taking the time. Really very inspirational story. Thank you for the work that you're doing to help these kids. I think that's great, and really would like to learn some more of your experience. Hopefully you can join us again. We can dive into some more stuff, but really appreciate your time today.
Anytime.
Thank you. And to everybody else, please keep safe. and enjoy your weekend. You'll see me in about 2 weeks' time with another special guest. This time we're heading out to the United Arab Emirates to talk to a very good friend of mine about cybersecurity and the impact and cyber over COVID-19 in the Middle East, but also some of the interesting things that they're doing out there, how the Middle East is actually catching. So until then, stay safe, have a great weekend, and we'll see you all soon. Cheers.